Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. One of the central teachings of the Buddhist doctrine is the idea of not self or emptiness. And for many people, particularly on first acquaintance with the idea, it also seems mysterious or difficult, counterintuitive. And that's a problem that comes from approaching the idea as a philosophical concept or as an intellectual puzzle. It makes it seem very difficult, obscure, and remote. The proper way to work with this is to try and see it in your own experience, moment by moment. And if you approach it that way, you'll find that it's really the skeleton key that opens up many doors. It's really the solution to many of the problems that we face in our lives and in our psyches, is the attachment to self. So one way to approach this is the idea of searching for the owner of the empty house and not finding him, as in the Zen story. That is, instead of making an abstract concept of not self, to notice concrete instances of not self in the present moment. The self, the idea of a self, is a mental formation. It's a concept, a created concept, a reference point. From an early age, you assume a position of a self, and you also assume the selfhood of objects of consciousness. You assume that things have an intrinsic independence, an independent reality. But if you look closely at any specific instance, you'll see that that doesn't apply. There's only a relation. The formulation, nothing exists from its own side. The idea of an intrinsic, substantial object is something we impose from the outside as a mental construction to make sense of reality. And we internalize that, we create a self-reference point. So approaching the search for, of not searching for not self, which as a concept you can't find it, but searching for a self, which you also won't find, but it's by a process of exhaustion. You see, this is not the self, that is not the self. Like King Melinda's chariot. Where is the essence of chariot if you tear it all apart? It's not to be found. The Buddha analyzed the human being as composed of these 5 aggregates: body, consciousness, feelings, perception, and mental formations. And nowhere in those bundles, those heaps, which is what khanda means, it means like a bundle, a heap, a pile. Nowhere in those aggregates can you find intrinsic essence of a self. You just find factors working dependent on each other, relational, not existing from their own side, but functioning in a matrix of cause and effect. And the Buddha further said that we create the illusion of a self in one of 4 ways, which is actually 20 ways because it applies to each of the 5 aggregates. You take one of the aggregates, like the body, and you make a mental assumption, I am the body, that's one, or I am in the body, or the body is in me, or the 4th is the body belongs to me. So this applies to each of the 5 aggregates. So one can create the illusion, I am consciousness, or consciousness is in me, or I am in consciousness, or consciousness belongs to me, and so on. It's useful to simplify this from the 4 times 5 to 20 ways, just a shorthand to think of it as not me, not mine. So any occurrence of a body-mind system, any object arising to consciousness, or consciousness itself, or the body, if you isolate it and contemplate it, look at it, you won't find it's the self. It's not me. I am not that. So you still might think naively, well, I am something else. But you just keep at it and notice each occurrence of the mind, I am not that. And perhaps more actively to take this position, not mine. Don't take ownership of it. This is a particular nuance that's very useful for dealing with troublesome states of mind like anxiety, fear, anxiety, or sadness, regret. When unpleasant negative states of mind arise, don't take ownership of them. There is a feeling of fear, but I am not fear, and that fear is not mine. It's an object of consciousness. And that immediately takes the sting out of it, the force out of it. It deflates it. But if you take ownership of it, you get caught in a spiral in the mind. This is me, this is mine. And it becomes a self-reinforcing loop in the mind that one gets caught in. This works very much with anxiety and states like that. If you can step back at them and look at them simply as objects of consciousness, this is a mental formation. It's dependently arisen, meaning it's part of a chain of cause and effect. It's not independent. It's not a standalone thing. It's essentially empty. There's nothing there. This is a very important thing to see with all mind states. We can suffer a great deal from the contents of our own mind, But if you look at the mental state, this is just an empty phenomena. There's nothing there. How much does a mental state weigh? What color is it? How much space does it take up? Those are meaningless questions because there's nothing there. It's void, it's empty, it's smoke and mirrors. And any feeling of fear or anxiety comes about from a reference to self. It's one of the qualities of Arahant, a fully awakened one, who has completely abandoned any concept of self at any subtle level, that he's completely fearless. Fear does not arise in the mind stream of an Arahant. There's nothing to fear because there's nothing to lose. As long as you take a position, a self position, then there is a feeling or a desire to protect that and to keep it stable and unchanging. And this cannot be done. There's nothing in this conditioned world that remains stable. And clinging to a desire for stability and unchangingness is just going to lead to suffering because you're desiring something that cannot be had. Another way of looking at the another angle to approach this idea of creating a self is at the levels of self-creation. There's at least three. The most superficial level is at the level of mental concept. You have an idea of a self, a construction. You have a sense of some belief or concept. It might be even belief might even be too strong a word because it might be entirely implicit. It might not be worked out in the mind. It's just an assumption of a self. Or it might be, in some cases, it is a explicit belief. But it's at the level of a mental concept. And at first, that's the dominant the dominant way we look at or think of a self. But as that attenuates, one can find a deeper level where we create a self out of desire. There's the desire mind wanting pleasurable phenomena and avoiding painful phenomena. And it references that to a self position. And even deeper than that, more subtle, and very elusive to approach, is the idea of creating a self through perception. The way we perceive the world. This is the quality of sanya, which is one of the five aggregates. And for understanding both your own psychology and also for the understanding the nature of the world, it's very important to try and get a handle on what perception is and how it works. Consciousness receives information through the sense organs: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin. And this is just in the form of raw data. The eye receives light waves. So eye consciousness knows only color and shape. But if you see a flower or a tree or a dog or the sun, this is actually perception. It's the second stage. If you look at the sun, eye consciousness only sees bright, round yellow. It doesn't see the sun. Much less does it see a tree or a person or your friend. It just sees colors and shapes. Then perception works that and perceives these things. And it has a creative aspect. Essentially, perception creates a simulation of the world that we live in. We never ever experience or touch outer reality directly. It's always mediated through the senses, and then perception takes these signals and fabricates a simulation that we actually experience. If the senses are in good order, and if the mind is healthy and sane, then the simulation will be accurate enough to function in. But it's still a second hand, it's a simulation. And how this relates to the self creation is that the perception can work and does work until one is very far along. It works from a privileged point of view. There's a lack of relativity. It's this point here, my consciousness, my center. This is the center of the universe, and it's an act of perception. It's how we perceive the world, how we create that simulation. So it's a very subtle level of self-creation. If one doesn't understand the nature of perception and its relationship to both consciousness and to any external reality there might be, then it's impossible to untangle and make sense of the whole experience of life. And you'll be caught in this self-referencing without being aware of it. It's just the way things seem to be. You'll find the more you can penetrate this idea of emptiness and not self, the less burden the mind will feel. It's like dropping heavy weights. And the calmer you'll be, the less anxious, and the more awake. This is really the way to open many doors. Is understanding the nature of emptiness, voidness. We talk about intrinsic qualities of all dhammas. There are three characteristics. The three characteristics are tilakkhana, and that is emptiness, impermanence, and what's usually called suffering, dukkha, but it's really more like imperfection or incompleteness, provisional nature. Any Dhamma that arises to the mind, that is any experience the conscious mind has, whether it's internal, like an idea or an emotion, or it's external, a sense impression, like a sight or a sound, any Dhamma that arises to the mind is going to be impermanent. That is, it's transient, it's flickering, it only really persists for a moment. It's empty, meaning it's void of self-substance. In the Indian philosophical tradition, this is called svabhava, own essence. This is something the non-Buddhist teachers in India, when they were describing the nature of reality, they would talk about things having an own essence, which is very close and corresponding to something in the Western thought from Aristotle, the idea of essence and qualities, that things have an essence and this is modified by qualities. Whereas the Buddhist conception, there's no real svabhava. There's no own essence. Things don't exist from their own side. They're really without substance, the individual dhammas. and they're unsatisfactory, they're provisional. And so this is experienced subjectively as dukkha or suffering, but this is also an objective quality inherent in all objects. And it's an inescapable fact of any kind of conditioned existence. By coming into manifestation, there is, by that very process of manifesting, there's an imperfection, there's a provisionalness, there's a brokenness. It's like a shard of reality. And this is the dynamism that keeps the universe humming along. If everything was perfect, or if anything was perfect, then the universe would cease to function. Everything would coalesce around this point of perfection. This is the dynamism of the conditioned world, is built of this interplay of these characteristics. And everything is intrinsically empty, impermanent, and unsatisfactory, incomplete, or provisional, imperfect. So if the entire experienced universe is this way, there's no reason to project inwardly anything different. There's just a process internally of dhammas arising and falling away, impermanent, all empty, all imperfect. And nowhere in that process can you find a standpoint that is stable, that's intrinsic. The Buddhist teaching of not self is in Pali is called anatta, which in Sanskrit would be anatman, which is the negation of atman, not atman, non-atman. The idea of atman was a pre-Buddhist concept that is very close to the Western idea of a soul. Atman was considered to be the unchanging, permanent, intrinsic essence of a being. For example, in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Hindu work, it's said that when a person dies and is reincarnated, the Atman is unchanged, but it's like a person going to sleep, then waking up and putting on a fresh suit of clothes. So it's like the core, the essence, and it's an unchanging quality in beings. But the Buddha come along, and with his direct penetration of reality, he saw that this is an illusion. There is no unchanging essence. There is no Atman. And letting go of that illusion, that conception, is immensely liberating. It frees the person from all kinds of internal anxieties and bondages and distress. And it opens up limitless possibilities. Some people, when they first encounter the teachings about not self, and this is mentioned in the suttas actually too, it's not only in modern times, that some people become frightened. They said, "Oh, I shall cease to be, I shall be no more." And that's a mistaken reaction, because the Buddha's teaching is not to destroy an existing thing. It's not to eliminate a self. It's just to see clearly within that there is no self to begin with. There's just an illusion. There's a fabrication that works like a limitation on the being. It's like you fenced yourself in. You're caught in this narrow little place of a self. And the fencing in is entirely of your own fabrication. It's not something intrinsic or real. It's simply a mental constraint you impose on yourself by the illusion of self. So as I, began this talk, I'll return to this central point, is that the approach to this idea is to take it one experience at a time and to recognize this is not me, this is not mine. You know, don't think you can grasp this teaching from the outside, as it were, philosophically or intellectually, and really get it. It has to be seen from the inside as a real experience. And you can apply this very directly as a medicine. If you find yourself in distressed states of mind, just to look at the contents of the mind and say, this is not me, this is not mine. I do not have to take ownership of this. I do not have to identify with this. This is empty. This is without substance.
Anamayam Dhammakataya Sadhu Karam Aramase.
Sadhu, 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 anumodhana.